In the hushed silence before dawn, the eternal city of Rome rested beneath the watchful gaze of the gods. The Tiber moved slowly, like the breath of an old man dreaming, its waters dark and reflective, mirroring the marble domes and rising columns that would soon glitter in the sun. Yet beyond this serene image of a sleeping empire stirred the heartbeat of 1,000 iron wills. A force not of marble or myth, but of discipline, order, and relentless endurance. The Roman legion, they were not born into armor. They were not at first conquerors. But through centuries of slow, determined transformation, the Roman legion evolved from a loose gathering of farmers called to arms into a machine so exacting, so potent in its quiet efficiency, that entire civilizations bent at its arrival and vanished in its wake. If Rome was the body, the legions were its sinews, taut and precise. They built as they destroyed, wrote in stone what they could not preserve in ink, and marched farther than most men dared to dream. Before Rome became a thunderous echo across continents, it was but a cluster of huts and ambition. The early armies of Rome bore the breath of the land, seasonal, untrained, summoned like a storm and gone with harvest. But ambition does not sleep long. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had begun to stretch beyond its hills and valleys. To survive beyond its cradle, it needed more than passion. It needed permanence. So the citizen soldier became the professional, and Rome, always pragmatic, began to sculpt something wholly new from the old clay. A legion was not just a gathering of men. It was an organism, alive with ranks and rituals, fed by a code of discipline so strict that to step aside in battle without command could mean death by your own comrade's hands. 10 cohorts made a legion, and each cohort was divided into centuries, though a century rarely numbered 100 men. Within these divisions pulsed layers of responsibility, hierarchy, and camaraderie. At the head stood the legate, a man of noble birth entrusted with command. Beneath him, tribunes carried orders and offered counsel. Centurions, grizzled and revered, barked orders and bore the weight of countless battles in their scars. And then there were the legionaries, the backbone of the empire. Clad in segmented armor, helmeted with discipline, and trained to move as one. Their training was not merely physical, but spiritual in its repetition. Every day, under the open sky, they practiced sword strikes and shield formations, marched long distances with full packs, dug trenches, built fortifications. They practiced how to kill, how to withstand fear, and how to obey without question. They learned the art of war as a ritual. Even their rations, dry, tough bread, salted pork, vinegar, were chosen for durability, not delight. And with each campaign, Rome's legions carried more than weapons. They brought the roads that would outlive them, the bridges that would bind cities, and the order that would reshape societies. They brought Latin, law, and architecture. In the shadows of battle, they planted the seeds of empire. But discipline came at a cost. To be a soldier of Rome was to surrender to its rhythm. The punishments were brutal, the rewards meager, and death was often closer than rest. Desertion or cowardice could result in decimation, the execution of 1 in every 10 men, chosen by lot. A punishment so cruel it was used sparingly, but its memory clung like smoke. The shield wall was their home. The gladius, a short stabbing sword, their tongue. They communicated through movement, through trumpet blasts and waving banners in silence and in storm. They built their camps with geometric precision every time, everywhere. A fort in a forest, a fortress in the sand, temporary, but indelibly Roman. And as they moved across the Alps, along the Rhine into the windswept Isles of Britannia, they encountered peoples who saw them not as men, but as omen. Their arrival meant change, often ruin, sometimes roads and baths, sometimes fire and chains. Yet in these confrontations, Rome absorbed as much as it imposed. It learned from the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Gauls. It borrowed gods, tactics, and ideas. And still the legions endured, adjusting, perfecting. In time, the legion became both symbol and symptom of Rome's greatness and of its eventual unraveling. For empires like men grow tired, and the more ground Rome claimed, the more blood it spilled to hold it. There came a point when the edges frayed, when the discipline that once held the legions like iron bands began to loosen. Recruits came not from Roman soil, but from the far-flung edges of the empire. Loyalty, once to Rome, shifted toward gold, toward generals, toward survival. Yet still, even in twilight, the legions retained echoes of their old glory. They would fight in distant deserts, in frozen forests, under the banners of emperors whose names faded faster than the roads their soldiers built. And then, in a flicker that seemed sudden only to the unobservant, the Western Roman Empire crumbled. The legions disbanded or became shadows of themselves. The iron discipline rusted. But the idea, the sheer magnitude of what they were, did not vanish. In monasteries and manuscripts, in cathedrals and castles, the memory of the legion lingered. In the drills of later armies, in the layout of cities, in the bones of Europe itself. Rome had passed, but its rhythm, the steady beat of the marching legion, continued to echo. And as the fires of that ancient order dimmed, new wanderers would stir the embers once more. Not with legions, but with longing. There was a boy, born in the shadows of Venice, whose eyes would one day look beyond Rome, beyond the known world, toward the east, toward silks and spices and cities whispered of in caravans. His name was Marco, and his journey would become the thread that bound two vast worlds. In the salt-kissed air of 13th century Venice, where sails bloomed like petals and laughter mingled with the clatter of trade, a young boy wandered the alleys and watched the ships. The sea was his horizon, yet his gaze often drifted beyond even that, to places whispered about in the candlelit corners of merchant halls. He was Marco, born to the Polo family, a name not yet gilded by legend, but already carried on the breath of distant winds. The Polo men were not strangers to travel. His father, Niccolò, and uncle Maffeo were merchants, quiet, pragmatic explorers who did not seek adventure for glory, but for trade. Long before Marco would ever leave the canals of Venice behind, they had crossed land and water, ventured past Constantinople, and drifted through the veils of Asia into realms few Westerners could imagine. They had stood before the great court of the Mongol emperor, Kublai Khan, who ruled from the heart of an empire that stretched like a shadow from the Pacific to the Caspian. In his presence, the Polos found not a savage tyrant, as stories in Europe often painted, but a man of sharp intellect and insatiable curiosity. The Khan, intrigued by their world, had one simple request: return to the West, bring back learned men, bring back the knowledge of Rome, and return again. And so years passed. When Niccolò and Maffeo returned to Venice, they found Marco grown. He was 17, with eyes like polished amber, thoughtful, observant, drawn more to silence than boast. They told him stories not as grand myths, but as simple truths. Of black stones that burned hotter than wood, of cities suspended above rivers, of silk that rippled like water in the wind. These tales settled into Marco's heart not as fables, but as invitations. In 1271, the three Polos departed again, this time with Marco. They left behind the lull of the lagoon, passed through Acre, over the sands of Persia, into the jagged spines of the Pamirs. It was a journey not counted in weeks, but in years. Dust and snow became familiar companions. They crossed roaring rivers and silent deserts, met scholars and warlords, followed the curve of the Silk Road like a melody carried across mountains. Marco watched, and he listened. He learned languages quickly, not just their words, but their music, the rhythm of how people thought. He began to write, not with ink at first, but within his memory. He tucked away stories like a monk copying sacred texts, carefully, reverently, faithfully. And then, after nearly 4 years, they arrived at Kublai Khan's court in Chengdu. It was a world unlike anything Marco had known. Gold roofs shimmered beneath the sun. The air hummed with poetry, debate, and the scent of jasmine. Elephants walked quietly through courtyards. Lanterns floated like dreams above the streets. Here, power did not roar, it glided. The Khan, aged and thoughtful, welcomed the Polos with warmth. And Marco, articulate, perceptive, and composed beyond his years, captured the emperor's interest. He spoke of Venice, of the Christian lands, of customs and kings. Soon he became not just a guest, but an envoy. The Khan sent him on missions, across rivers, through kingdoms, into the hidden folds of an empire so vast that it eclipsed all maps. Marco traveled for years within the Mongol realm. He witnessed the order of the postal system, a network of way stations so efficient that messages crossed continents faster than many armies. He described paper money, strange and wondrous to a man raised on coins. He saw gunpowder used for celebration, not yet for war. And he observed a society where tolerance, at least for a time, was policy, where Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and Confucianists debated beneath the same palace roofs. To Marco, the East was not exotic. It was orderly, strange, beautiful, brutal, rational, a mirror of the West, cracked at different angles. And all the while, he remembered, for 17 years the Polos remained in the Mongol Empire. But time pulls at even the strongest threads. The Khan aged and the future became uncertain. The Polos sought leave, fearing what might come when the great emperor passed. Reluctantly, the Khan allowed them to return, tasking them with escorting a princess to Persia, a journey fraught with risk across ocean and storm. Their return voyage spanned 2 years. Many perished. The sea, always indifferent, claimed its share. But the Polos endured. When they arrived in Venice, few recognized them. They had left as merchants. They returned as myths. Dressed in Eastern robes, speaking languages foreign to their kin, carrying gems sewn into their seams, they were at once familiar and alien. They had crossed into the realm of legend. But Marco's story was not yet finished. In a twist of fate, he was captured during a naval conflict with Genoa. Imprisoned in a stone cell, he found a companion, Rustichello da Pisa, a writer of romances. And there, in the dim light of captivity, Marco began to speak. Not boastfully, but plainly. He recounted what he had seen, the cities, the customs, the emperors, the ceremonies, the marvels. Rustichello wrote, "The book that emerged, Il Milione, became a bridge between two worlds. To some, it was fantasy. To others, revelation. It was read by kings, popes, explorers. It would one day fall into the hands of a young man named Cristoforo Colombo, who would scribble in its margins and dream of passage to the east by sailing west. Marco lived the rest of his days in Venice, quieter now, surrounded by the scent of salt and the sound of sails. When asked on his deathbed if the stories he told were true, he whispered, 'I have not told half of what I saw.' And perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps no man could. For some journeys are too vast for words, and some truths cannot be caught by parchment or pen. Yet his tale endured, not because it was loud, but because it was alive. The story of the Roman legion and the travels of Marco Polo are not simply tales of battle and distance. They are stories of structure and wonder, of duty and curiosity, of two vastly different ways the human soul stretches itself across the horizon of history. One moves in step and formation, the other in awe and silence, but both leave footprints that do not fade easily. Rome in its time had sought to define the world. Its legions carved borders in stone and fire, and in doing so they reshaped the very meaning of civilization. But centuries after the last eagle standard fell into the dust, it was not the sword that traveled farthest. It was the story. The idea of Rome, its law, its symmetry, its iron will, lingered in the architecture of ambition. Likewise, Marco Polo's journey was not the conquest of a land, but the mapping of wonder. Where the legion marched to bind the world, Marco wandered to understand it. He moved not with command, but with observation, not to subdue, but to witness. In his quiet record-keeping, he planted seeds of distant dreams. And those seeds would bloom in the minds of men who would sail oceans and redraw the map of the known. And in between these two, the sword and the scroll, lies a deeper rhythm, the journey of the human spirit. Always forward, always reaching. Whether bound in armor or robed in silk, whether crossing deserts with banners or notebooks, there is in every age the longing to know what lies beyond the edge of the familiar. But empires do not last. Their edges bleed, their hearts forget, their glory softens into memory. What remains are traces. The outline of a fort buried beneath wild grass, a traveler's journal faded with time, a single coin unearthed beneath centuries of dust. These are the whispers of those who came before. After Marco Polo's death, Venice returned to its own slow rhythm. The canals rose and fell with the moon. Gondolas drifted beneath bridges built before his birth. And still, in taverns and halls, his name lingered. There were those who doubted, of course. Men who scoffed at tales of paper money in great cities where dogs wore silk and hawks were trained to hunt game from horseback. But disbelief does not erase truth. Time has a gentler way of proving the dreamer right. Centuries later, as archaeologists sifted through the buried bones of long-lost kingdoms, many of Marco's claims found quiet confirmation. The palaces, the customs, the distances, they matched. His eye had been true. His pen, or rather, his voice in the hand of Rustichello, had painted the world as it was, not just as he imagined it. But perhaps more important than what was accurate was what was inspired. For his tale, in all its breadth, lit a fire. It reminded the West that the world was vast, complex, and already in motion long before it ever knocked at Europe's door. It taught that wonder was not a Western invention, nor civilization a Roman monopoly. There were other centers, other empires, other ways of being. The Mongol Empire, so central to Marco's journey, was itself a fleeting giant. It rose on the backs of horsemen and fractured beneath the weight of distance. Yet in its height it connected the world like a spine, from the Pacific coast to the steppes of Europe. It allowed for the passage of silk and silver, of merchants and monks. And in its openness, it allowed a boy from Venice to pass through its gates and return with stories that would echo for centuries. If the Roman legion had once enforced a kind of order on the ancient world, the Mongol network had momentarily allowed it to speak. And Marco, like a reed between two winds, carried the voice of one world into the ear of another. In this way, history is not always a straight line. Sometimes it curves, it loops, it listens to itself through time. And the stories that survive, those of the soldiers in perfect formation and of the lone traveler on a dusty road, become not just accounts of the past, but mirrors for those who come after. For in every era, there are those who march and those who wander, those who build walls and those who slip between them. Both are needed. And both, if remembered with care, become part of something larger than empire or expedition. They become memory. The Roman legion, in all its precision, had once believed in permanence. The rhythm of its boots, the clang of its armor, the exactitude of its movements, these were not only tools of conquest, but promises. A legion built roads that outlived kings. It planted colonies, laws, language. It believed that order could outpace chaos. That stone and sword, working together, could hold the future in place. And for a time, it did. But permanence is a mirage to the tides of history. Beneath the weight of bureaucracy and betrayal, of overreach and forgetting, the very empire that had seemed eternal began to crumble from within. What the legions could once secure with discipline, they could no longer hold with fear. Loyalty frayed, supply lines stretched. The core of the empire, once so solid, began to pulse with rot. In the final centuries of the Western Empire, the legions were shadows of their former selves. The old Roman citizen soldier was replaced by foreign recruits. Not unwelcome, many fought bravely with conviction, but the shift marked a quiet change in identity. Rome was no longer Rome in the old sense. It had become a memory worn like armor, heavy and cracked. And yet, even as the empire fell, the idea of the legion endured. It found echoes in the Byzantine armies that fought under golden icons, in the tactics studied by Charlemagne, in the columns of Renaissance paintings. Rome's military manuals, its roads, its fortresses, all became guides for later generations trying to rebuild the shape of strength. Even now, the languages of law and strategy, of citizenship and empire, carry traces of the legion's march. In this way, Rome did not die. It dissolved into the bloodstream of history, like salt into the sea. Marco Polo's story, though shaped by different winds, carries a parallel truth. His journey was not one of command or enforcement. It was a witness, fragile, subjective, but precious. He moved not to conquer, but to understand, and through him, Europe glimpsed the architecture of a world beyond its maps. After his return, others followed. Explorers, traders, missionaries, colonizers, each with their own motives, their own compass points. Some carried hope, others hunger. And while many forgot Marco's humility, his awe, they nonetheless walked through the door he had left open. It would be centuries before the East and West would meet again with such clarity. In between came war and fire, conquest and colonization, misunderstanding and theft. But somewhere within the storm, the memory of that first Venetian observer remained, a boy who looked eastward, not with greed, but with wonder. What binds the story of the Legion and the traveler is not just their setting in time, but their place in human longing. One sought to impose order on the world. The other sought to see it for what it was. And both in their own way remind us that history is made not just of victories or maps, but of attention. The Legion taught us that discipline can build empires. Marco Polo taught us that curiosity can bridge them. And in the quiet spaces between their steps, on the dusty roads of Gaul, in the silent deserts of Persia, beneath the stars over the steppe, there lies the true soul of history. Not in the shouting of kings, but in the footprints of those who walked with purpose. Time passes, walls fall, books decay, but the rhythm of the human journey continues. There is always another road, another horizon, another story waiting to be remembered. In every great turning of the world, there are those who walk ahead of the rest. Scouts of time, whether armored or robed, sent forward into lands unseen. The Roman legionaries, trained to endure and enforce, and the Venetian merchant who became a witness to empires, both belonged to this order of restless humanity. It is easy to see history as a series of events, wars declared, borders drawn, treaties signed, but history also lives in the long silences between those moments, in the steady cadence of marching feet along a road no longer used, in the pause before a traveler knocks at a foreign gate, in the waiting, the watching, the remembering. For the Roman soldier, much of life was waiting. A legionary might spend years garrisoned in some wind-bitten outpost, the edge of empire marked not by glory but by mud and patience. He would wake to frost on his boots, tend to his armor with care, drill in the courtyard with the same motions he had learned a decade prior. His letters, if they came at all, arrived months late, ink smudged, words half lost. He dreamed of olive groves and kitchens, of markets thick with noise and fruit, of the smell of home. And yet he remained, not always out of loyalty, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of duty, sometimes because he had forgotten how to leave. It is in these quiet legions, the ones not etched into triumphal arches, that the empire truly lived. They kept its shape, its rhythm. They ensured that the idea of Rome stretched farther than its heart could reach. In the east, Marco Polo too found himself in stillness. Though remembered for travel, much of his 17 years in the Mongol Empire were spent in place, observing, recording, translating experience into meaning. He was not a knight-errant on a continuous quest, but often a guest, a diplomat, a listener. The road may have brought him wonder, but it was the pause that gave it weight. The Silk Road, which carried him and so many others across continents, was not just a trade route, it was a river of humanity. Along its bends sat caravansaries and tea-houses, markets and monasteries. Ideas flowed beside spices and jade. It was possible to sit at one end and hear whispers of beliefs born on the other. Buddhism journeyed west. Christianity ventured east. Languages bled into each other. A merchant might know half a dozen tongues, not from schooling, but from survival. It is here, too, that history unfolds not through conquest, but through contact. A Roman might have met a Parthian and seen an enemy, but a merchant saw a client, a monk, a soul, a traveler, a story. As centuries passed, the boundaries between these identities blurred. Former legion posts became cities with mixed bloodlines. Caravan trails became towns where no single tongue dominated. Even empires, for all their pride in purity, owed their survival to borrowing, of tactics, of gods, of grain, of tools. Marco Polo, the one man, represented this borrowing in motion. In his words, the East was not rendered alien, but knowable. Vast, yes, complex, layered, rich beyond expectation, but not monstrous, not demonic. He described its governance, its philosophies, its markets, its people. He did not elevate the West above it, nor kneel before its throne. He simply looked and recorded. And that act, to see without conquest, became its own kind of revolution. Perhaps that is what history needs most in its telling. Not only the clamor of armies or the proclamations of kings, but the quiet presence of those who saw, who waited, who remembered. The legionary, with his worn sandals and scarred shield, did not know that his daily march would one day shape the map of Europe. Marco, with dust in his cloak and ink in his mind, could not have guessed that a boy in Genoa would read his story and imagine a new world. But that is how history lives, in unknowing. It lingers in the footstep, in the page, in the silence before the storm. And long after the empires are gone, it whispers still. In the ruins of Roman forts, now softened by moss and years, one can still trace the outline of the old world, the straightness of roads built with geometric will, the careful placement of gates, the symmetry that whispered of control. Here the past is not loud. It does not announce itself with trumpets. It murmurs through stones warmed by centuries of sun. To walk these places is to walk in the company of ghosts, not of spirits that haunt, but of lives that once filled the air with routine. Soldiers waking to roll call, blacksmiths hammering at dull light, scribal officers counting grain, the scent of lentils cooking, the sound of sandals scuffing gravel, all gone now and yet somehow still here. And in these same silences, thousands of miles away, lay the trails once taken by Marco Polo. In the oases of Central Asia, beneath dunes that shift with every wind, stories sleep. Cities that bloomed and vanished, scripts no longer spoken, walls half swallowed by the desert. They too whisper of caravans heavy with silk and thought, of astronomers charting skies under foreign stars, of young men from Venice staring wide-eyed at the scale of a world they had not imagined. History does not always linger where we expect. It hides in forgotten wells, in worn staircases, in the corner of a map. Its endurance is not only in records, but in repetition, in the echo of footsteps retraced, in questions asked again, in wonder rediscovered. Consider the simple idea of a road. The Romans built them with intent, straight, reliable, stretching across forests and hills, across marshes and mountains. They were arteries of power, built not just for travel, but for presence, to remind distant provinces that Rome was never far away. Even now, many of those roads lie beneath our own, repaved, renamed, but still following the same line, like a memory that refuses to fade. The Silk Road was different. It had no single architect, no imperial decree. It was a path born of need, of trade, survival, pilgrimage, escape. It twisted and branched, grew and shrank with the age. It was fragile, always at the mercy of climate, politics, and peace, and yet it endured too. Not as stone, but as flow. A path not of conquest, but of conversation. And so, two visions of travel, one fixed and formal, the other fluid and shifting. One a declaration, the other a dialogue. Yet in both we see the same yearning, to connect, to stretch the known toward the unknown. The legions once marched into lands they called barbarian, believing themselves to be the bringers of civilization. And yet in time those very lands reshaped Rome as much as Rome reshaped them. Germanic customs seeped into Latin law. Eastern beliefs mingled with Western rites. The conquerors were changed, often without knowing it. So too with Marco. Though he returned to Venice and tried to speak of what he had seen, the East was no longer separate from him. It had carved itself into his rhythm, his gaze. The boy who had left a narrow world returned as something more complex. A man who had walked inside another culture and emerged neither conqueror nor missionary, but witness. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of his journey. For all that we build, for all the maps we redraw, the true measure of a civilization lies not in what it conquers, but in what it can behold without fear. Rome, at its peak, struggled with that balance. Its legions were unmatched, but its gaze was often narrow. It saw through the lens of control. The East, in Marco's time, offered another path, one of scale and patience, of dynasties that thought in centuries, not campaigns. There was cruelty, yes, and ambition, but also an acceptance that the world was vast and could not be held in a single hand. And in the space between these two great forces, the structured hand of the West and the wandering heart of the East, Marco Polo walked, not to take, but to see. Not to command, but to carry home a vision larger than his origin. In doing so, he gifted something rare, a story that bent no knee, drew no sword, claimed no throne, and yet changed everything. When we speak of history, we often speak of the loudest things, the battles that rang across valleys, the proclamations carved into stone, the names that crowned empires and outlived their own children. But beneath all of it, like an underground stream, there flows a softer current, the memory of those who moved through the world with quieter steps. The soldier who stood watch, the merchant who counted stars, the child who listened to their stories. And sometimes these quiet lives become bridges, not by force, not by fate, but by simple continuity. The legionary standing guard in a frozen province did not imagine that his camp's foundations would one day be rediscovered by men with notebooks and brushes. The traveler in Mongol courts did not know that his words would stir a sailor's dream a century later. Yet they did. Because history, at its gentlest, is a long conversation. One voice reaching another across time. When Marco Polo lay old and fading in Venice, the world around him had already begun to forget. His homeland had changed. The streets were narrower, the faces newer. He was a man who had seen too much to speak easily. There were those who still visited him, asking for tales of jeweled cities and horsemen with hawks, of towers that scraped the sky and banquets beneath golden ceilings. He gave them what he could, but much remained inside. At the end, he whispered that he had not told the half of it. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps he could not. Some things once seen live only in silence, in the private chamber of memory, in dreams that even parchment cannot hold. But what he did tell was enough. And like all good stories, it did not end with him. Centuries later, his journey would guide others, not along the same path, but toward the same impulse, to look outward, to wonder, to go. And the same was true of the Legion. Though Rome's banners no longer fly, though its Senate has long fallen silent, the habits it carved into the world remain. The shape of its roads, the thought of its law, the architecture of its order. Even in ruins, Rome builds. Even in silence, it speaks. So much of the past has vanished, so many names are lost, but some truths remain. That we are not the first to walk these roads, that others came before, with sandals or scrolls, with spears or questions, and they too stood at the edge of the known and asked what lay beyond. And that is the heart of it, the quiet message passed down by stone and parchment, by soldier and scribe, that the world is wide, that it is beautiful, and that it was never meant to be known all at once, but slowly, tenderly, through the eyes of those willing to walk a little farther. And so we remember the legionary, not for the wars he fought, but for the roads he held. And we remember Marco, not for the miles he traveled, but for the wonder he carried back. For in the end, history belongs not to the strongest, but to the ones who choose to see.